There is a kind of love that asks nothing in return. It does not keep score. It does not measure sacrifice against reward. It simply shows up day after day, year after year, because somewhere deep in the human heart, there is a belief that devotion, this complete, this total, this unconditional, must mean something. It must be worth something. It must be safe. Love powerful stories? Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you never miss one. Share your thoughts in the comments. Margaret Calloway, everyone who knew her called her Maggie, had that kind of love. She had it for her husband, for her children, for her students, for the neighbors who came to her porch on hard days and left an hour later feeling a little lighter. People who grew up around Maggie Calloway will tell you, if you ask them, that she was the kind of woman who made you believe the world was still fundamentally good. That goodness was real, that it was rewarded. And for 31 years of her life, she had no reason to doubt any of that. And then she found out the truth. Not slowly, not with time to prepare, but in a single afternoon, in the front seat of her own car, parked down the street from the house she had cleaned and managed and poured herself into for 15 years. She found out. And what she found did not just break her heart. It dismantled every memory she had. It reached back through 15 years and rewrote every moment. Every bedside morning, every therapy appointment, every night she had stayed awake listening to make sure he was still breathing. And it turned all of it into something she could barely stand to name. This is not a story about a car accident. It is not a story about paralysis or wheelchairs or disability payments, though all of those things are part of it. This is a story about what one man was willing to take, and how completely, and for how long, he got away with it. And it is a story about what happens to a woman who gave everything to someone who was lying to her from almost the very beginning. Before we go any further, I want to pause and ask, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already subscribed to this channel, please do it now. Because this is the kind of story you are going to want to share, and there are more coming that you will not want to miss. Maggie Calloway was born Margaret Ann Reese in the summer of 1963 in Dayton, Ohio. She was the second of 4 children raised by a factory foreman named Gerald and a stay-at-home mother named Ruth, who baked bread every Saturday morning and kept a vegetable garden in the backyard that the whole neighborhood seemed to benefit from. It was a household built on the quiet virtues: hard work, loyalty, service to others, the idea that you do not abandon the people you love when things get difficult. Those were not abstract values in the Reese household. They were practiced daily, visibly, without fanfare. Maggie carried those values the way some people carry a family name. She went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, studied education, and came back to the Dayton area to teach 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary School, a low-income public school where the chairs were mismatched and the budgets were stretched, and the children, many of them, arrived in the morning without having eaten breakfast. She bought food with her own money and kept it in a cabinet. She stayed late. She wrote letters of recommendation for students who were applying to magnet middle schools that most of their parents had never heard of. She was, by every account from every person who knew her in those years, an extraordinary human being in an entirely ordinary and unassuming way. She met Dennis Calloway in the spring of 1984 at a birthday party for a mutual friend. He was 22 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, yet with a wide and easy smile and the kind of confidence that fills a room without demanding it. He was working in logistics at the time, managing shipping routes for a regional distributor, and he had plans. He was always talking about his plans: a better job, a house with a real yard, a business someday, maybe, something of his own. Maggie had heard men like that before, men full of big talk and small follow-through, but something about Dennis felt different. His energy was not the energy of a man performing for an audience. It felt, to her, like genuine hunger, like he actually believed the things he was saying. They were married in the fall of 1986. She was 23. He was 24. The wedding was small, and the reception was in the backyard of her parents' home, and people who were there still talk about how happy they both looked. Maggie's mother cried through the entire ceremony. Her father gave a toast so short and precise that Half the guests laughed and the other half wiped their eyes. Dennis had no prepared remarks. He just stood up and said, "She is the best person I have ever met." He sat back down. Everyone applauded. For 19 years, they built a life together. 2 children, a son named Tyler, born in 1989, and a daughter named Kristen, born in 1993. A house in a quiet subdivision outside Columbus that they spent 5 years renovating room by room, arguing pleasantly about paint colors and tile choices the way couples do when they have the luxury of arguing about small things. Maggie continued teaching. Dennis moved through several logistics positions over the years, never quite landing at the level he always believed he was destined for, but making a decent living, keeping the household stable. They had friends. They had summer vacations. They had problems, the ordinary kind. Money stress, the distant rumbles of dissatisfaction that accumulate in any marriage across 19 years. The stretches where they felt more like roommates than partners and had to find their way back to each other. But they always found their way back. What no one outside the marriage knew, and what Maggie herself did not fully understand until years later, was that by 2004, Dennis Calloway was in serious financial trouble. Not catastrophic, not yet, but the kind of trouble that lives in the back of your throat and makes it hard to sleep. He had made some bad investments. He had taken on debt he had not disclosed to Maggie quietly through credit accounts she did not know existed. He had lent money to a brother who did not pay it back. He had turned down a stable promotion at his company 3 years earlier because he was still waiting for something bigger, something worthy of him. And that bigger thing had not materialized. By the end of 2005, Dennis Calloway owed more money than he could manage, and he was running out of options. And Maggie, still teaching, still saving, still operating inside the marriage she believed she was in, did not know any of it. On the evening of February 14, 2006, Valentine's Day, Dennis Calloway got into his car and drove north on Interstate 71 outside Columbus. It was a Tuesday. It was cold. Maggie was home watching television. I'm expecting him back from what he had told her was a late dinner with a work contact. At approximately 9:17 in the evening, Dennis's car left the highway and struck a concrete barrier at what investigators later estimated was just under 60 miles per hour. He did not die. But when the paramedics arrived and when the emergency room physicians assessed the damage, the word they used was catastrophic. Spinal cord injury, temporary paralysis of the lower extremities, possible permanent loss of function. They could not yet say with certainty how much of it would be lasting. They told Maggie to prepare herself. She drove to the hospital in her robe. She left the television on. She did not call anyone until she arrived and had spoken to the surgeon and understood what she was dealing with. And then she called her mother and said, "I very quietly, Dennis has been in an accident and I think it is very bad." Her mother asked if she should come. Maggie said, "Not tonight." She needed to think. She would call in the morning. She sat with Dennis for the rest of that night, in a chair beside his bed, listening to the machines, holding his hand. In the weeks that followed, Dennis received the level of medical care that a serious spinal injury requires. There was imaging. There was physical therapy. There were consultations with specialists. And here is where the story begins to diverge from what Maggie was told. Because the medical record that was being built inside those hospital walls and rehabilitation centers contained information that Dennis Calloway understood very clearly, and that Maggie never saw. Approximately 6 weeks after the crash, something remarkable began to happen. Dennis began to recover. Not fully, not in any way that was announced or celebrated or communicated to his wife, but the clinical evidence was accumulating in black and white. An MRI conducted in the days immediately after the accident had shown something that the treating physicians noted carefully in their report. There were no significant cord abnormalities. The injury to the spinal cord was real, and the initial paralysis was genuine, but the damage was not of the permanent kind. A follow-up physical examination in the fall of 2005 noted explicitly, in language that would later be read aloud in a federal courtroom, that Dennis's paralysis had, quote, "lucior isons entris lasciatorist," resolved somewhat, and that he was able to move his lower extremities. A subsequent evaluation in December of 2006 recorded that he was performing certain essential daily activities with complete or modified independence, including walking and using the bathroom unassisted. Dennis Calloway knew this. He sat in those examination rooms. He received those reports. He understood what was being documented. And at some point in late 2006 or early 2007, the exact moment cannot be identified with certainty, Dennis made a decision. He would not report the recovery. He would not tell his wife. He would not tell the insurance company or the disability board or any of the people and institutions that were, at that point, building a financial and medical infrastructure around the premise that he was permanently paralyzed. He would keep the wheelchair. He would keep the appointments. He would keep the performance going because the performance was worth something. More than something. It was worth everything. In October of 2007, Dennis attended a Veterans Administration pension and compensation examination. The examining physician, who, it would later come out, did not have access to Dennis's earlier medical records and did not request them and did not order an X-ray because, in his words, he did not feel it was worth the trauma of the manipulation required, documented what Dennis told him. He had been paralyzed in both lower extremities since his accident. He was confined to a wheelchair. His condition was permanent. Based almost entirely on that examination, Dennis Calloway was granted a disability classification that entitled him to benefits he would collect for the next 14 years. The total amount, by the time investigators finally added it up, was just over $760,000. Maggie quit teaching in the fall of 2007. Dennis needed round-the-clock care, or so she believed, and the logistics of managing his medical appointments, his medication schedules, his physical therapy sessions, the accessibility modifications to the house, the ramps, the bathroom grab bars, the widened doorways, were more than could be handled while also working full-time. She made the decision herself, without being asked, because that is who Maggie Calloway was. The people who loved her were grateful for this quality. Dennis Calloway weaponized it. For the next 8 years, from 2007 to 2015, Maggie's life was organized entirely around her husband's needs. She bathed him. She managed his medications. She accompanied him to every medical appointment. She learned to perform the specific maneuvers required to prevent pressure sores in a person who cannot shift their own weight. She attended caregiver support groups and read medical literature and advocated fiercely in waiting rooms and doctors' offices for the level of attention she felt Dennis deserved. She gave up her social life incrementally. First the things that required evenings away from the house, then the things that required whole days, then eventually the easy spontaneity that makes friendship sustainable over time. Carol Hines, her closest friend since college, remained in her life, but Maggie had less and less of herself to offer, and Carol, who was perceptive and patient, simply kept showing up and never made Maggie feel guilty about what the caregiving had cost her. The children grew up. Tyler finished college in Indiana and moved to Chicago for work. Kristen went to nursing school, a choice, she would later say, that was absolutely and entirely her mother's influence, and settled in Cincinnati. Both of them visited regularly. Both of them watched their mother care for their father with something that felt, when they were young, like admiration, and that curdled as they got older and more perceptive, into something they did not quite have a name for. A discomfort. A feeling that something in the household was slightly wrong in a way they could not identify. Kristen mentioned to a friend once, years before the truth came out, that her father had always seemed more engaged and alert than she expected someone with his level of disability to be. She felt guilty for thinking it. She never said it out loud again. Dennis, for his part, played his role with discipline. At home, in front of Maggie and the children and the neighbors and the physicians who came to the house for assessments, he was the man in the wheelchair. He managed his expressions carefully. He allowed himself the small performances of frustration and grief that would seem natural in a person adjusting to permanent disability. The occasional flash of anger, the quiet depressive episodes, the moments of fierce gratitude when Maggie did something kind. He was, by all visible accounts, a man living inside a terrible limitation with as much dignity as he could manage. And he was convincing because he was committed. He had had years to practice. What Maggie did not know, what she had no mechanism to suspect, because she was not the kind of person who surveils the people she loves, was that Dennis had also built another life. Not secretly in any dramatic or elaborate sense, but quietly, carefully, the way a man builds something he knows he cannot afford to have discovered. There were trips, medical trips, he called them, to specialists in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia, in Cleveland, always framed as necessary consultations that he preferred to handle alone because, as he put it, he did not want to burden her with one more thing. Maggie never questioned this. Of course she didn't. Of course she respected his desire for a small amount of autonomy. Of course she trusted him. The money flowed. The disability payments, the insurance settlements, the caregiver compensation, more than $8,000 per month, every month for years. Some of it went to the household, to the mortgage, and the utilities and the medical equipment, and the accessible vehicle that Dennis told the benefits program he needed and that he used to drive himself, alone, standing, to the life he was maintaining in Pennsylvania. Some of it went to things Maggie never saw and never expected. A gym membership maintained under a different name in a suburb outside Pittsburgh. A BMW sports coupe, not exactly the kind of vehicle associated with a man who cannot use his legs, purchased with a grant from the disability program and later totaled on a highway in western Pennsylvania, in circumstances Dennis explained to Maggie as a transportation accident involving the accessible shuttle service he had been using. Maggie believed him. She had believed him for 20 years. She was very good at it. In the spring of 2015, Maggie received a phone call from a man named Gary Stetson. Gary had worked with Dennis in logistics in the mid-90s before the accident, and had heard through mutual acquaintances that Dennis had been injured and disabled. He had thought about reaching out for years and never quite found the moment. He was calling now, he said, because he wanted Maggie to know something that was weighing on him, and that he felt she deserved to hear. 3 weeks earlier, Gary had attended a regional logistics conference in Indianapolis. And in the lobby of the hotel, on the second morning of the conference, he had seen a man who looked exactly like Dennis Calloway, standing, walking across the lobby with a coffee in his hand, wearing a suit jacket, laughing with another man. Gary had done a double take. He had looked again. He had told himself it was impossible, that Dennis had been paralyzed for nearly a decade, that he was misremembering what Dennis looked like. He walked away and spent 3 days trying to convince himself he had been mistaken. He had not been mistaken. Maggie thanked Gary for calling. She told him that she was sure it had been someone who resembled Dennis, that these things happened, that her husband had not been to Indianapolis in years. She hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a long time, very still, looking at nothing in particular. She did not bring it up to Dennis that night, or the night after. She needed, she would explain later, to sit with what Gary had said in a private place inside herself before she did anything with it, because the implications of taking it seriously were so large, so completely life-altering, that she could not approach them directly. She had to circle them. She had to let herself feel the full weight of the possibility before she could decide what to do next. What she noticed, in the days that followed, was that she had been not noticing things for a long time. The way Dennis's legs sometimes shifted in his wheelchair, not the passive repositioning of a person being moved, but the small, almost involuntary adjustments of a body with sensation and muscle control in the limbs. She had filed this away, without realizing, in a folder labeled Things I Do Not Need to Think About. The way he occasionally flinched when something dropped near his feet. You do not flinch at a sound near a part of your body that you cannot feel. She had filed that away too. The way he always managed to be out of the wheelchair and in bed before she came into the bedroom at night, so that the mechanical process of transferring him, which she had expected to be a shared ritual and which had never quite become one, was always somehow already accomplished. She had told herself he was trying to preserve her energy. She had believed it because she wanted to. She called Carol. Carol picked up on the second ring, and Maggie told her about Gary's phone call, and there was a silence on the other end of the line that went on long enough that Maggie understood, in a terrible instant, what it meant. She said, "Carol?" Carol said, "Maggie, I didn't know how to tell you. I've been sitting with this for 2 years." Maggie asked what she meant. Carol said she had seen Dennis at a gas station on the west side of Columbus, standing next to his car. Not leaning. Not using anything for support. Standing. She had told herself she was wrong. She had told herself the light was bad, or her eyes were bad, or that she had simply not understood how much rehabilitation could accomplish for certain patients, or a dozen other things that let her keep her best friend's marriage intact and her own conscience quiet. She had been wrong to stay quiet. She knew that. She was sorry. Maggie drove home from Carol's house that evening and sat in the driveway for 40 minutes before going inside. It took Maggie 3 weeks to do what she did next. 3 weeks of functioning normally, of bathing her husband and managing his medications and making his meals and sleeping beside him in the bed they had shared for 20 years, with this thing living inside her chest that she could not speak out loud. She moved through those 3 weeks on pure discipline. She laughed when she was supposed to laugh. She answered the phone. She made grocery runs and folded laundry and sat across the dinner table from Dennis and watched his face and tried to read it the way she had been reading it for 30 years, looking for the things she had always been too close to see. She installed a small camera in the living room. She told herself she just needed to know. She was not going to act on anything, not going to confront him, not going to call anyone until she knew for certain. She had given 15 years of her life to this man. She deserved certainty. For 2 days, the camera recorded nothing out of the ordinary. Dennis in his wheelchair, moving through the house the way he always moved, with the careful, economical motion of a man who has spent years learning to navigate his environment from a seated position. Maggie watched the footage each evening, sitting in her car in the Kroger parking lot because she could not bring herself to watch it in the house. Nothing. She began to wonder if Gary had been wrong after all. She began to wonder if Carol had misremembered. She began to feel the particular shame of a person who has suspected someone they love without sufficient cause, and she dreaded what that would do to her if she was wrong. On the third day, a Thursday afternoon, Maggie told Dennis she needed to go to the pharmacy and would be back within the hour. She drove down the block. She parked with a view of the front of the house. She turned the engine off. She sat. She waited for 37 minutes. She knew the exact duration afterward because she checked her phone repeatedly and could not stop tracking the time, as if the numbers on the screen were the only solid thing available to hold on to. And then the front door of the house opened, and Dennis Calloway walked out. Not shuffled, not dragged himself to the doorframe and stood there. He walked out. He came down the porch steps, 3 steps, without holding the railing. He walked to the far end of the porch, reached into the pocket of his jeans, pulled out a cigarette and a lighter, and lit it. He stood there in the thin afternoon light, smoking, looking at the street, completely at ease, in a body that for 15 years he had told her was unable to carry him. Maggie Calloway sat in her car and watched her husband smoke a cigarette on his own front porch, and she did not make a sound. She did not cry. She did not move. She sat there until he finished the cigarette and went back inside, and then she drove to Carol's house, and she walked in without knocking, and she sat down on Carol's kitchen floor, and that is where Carol found her, sitting on the linoleum with her back against the cabinet, very still, looking at the wall. Our Carol sat down beside her. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she put her arm around Maggie's shoulders and Maggie said, in a voice that Carol described later as the quietest and most frightening thing she had ever heard, "He can walk." Carol said she knew. Maggie said, "He has been able to walk this whole time." Carol said she knew. And Maggie said, "Then what were these 15 years?" That question, that simple, devastating question, is the one that would follow Maggie Calloway for the rest of what came next. Not just through the investigation and the trial, but long after, into the rebuilt version of her life she had to construct from scratch in the years that followed. What were these 15 years? What did they mean? What does it mean to give everything you have to something that was not real? Before we go any further into what happened next, the investigation, what the investigators found, what Dennis had actually been doing with 15 years of disability payments, I want to take a moment and ask you to think about something. Think about the people in your life right now who you trust completely. The people around whom you have no defenses because it has never occurred to you that you would need them. The people for whom you would quit your job, rearrange your life, give up your mornings and your evenings and your ability to make plans further than 24 hours ahead. Now imagine discovering that one of those people had made a choice, at some point, to let you do all of that, knowing full well that it was built on a lie. Imagine that. That is what Maggie Calloway had to reckon with. Not in the abstract, in the specific, daily, flesh and blood reality of her own kitchen and her own bedroom and her own memory. She called a lawyer the morning after she sat on Carol's kitchen floor. The lawyer connected her to an insurance fraud investigator. And the investigator, a former federal agent named Raymond Okafor, who had worked disability fraud cases for 11 years, and who had, by his own account, never encountered one of this duration and proximity, pulled the records and spent about 90 minutes looking at them before he called Maggie back and said, very carefully, that she needed to understand what she was dealing with. The disability payments were still active. They had been active, uninterrupted, for nearly a decade. On the caregiver compensation that Dennis had been receiving, money allocated on the premise that Maggie herself was providing round-the-clock professional care, money that was paid to Dennis and that Maggie had assumed was being used for household expenses, had been flowing into an account she did not have access to. Over the course of the years that Okafor's team began to reconstruct, the total came to more than $760,000. Some of it had gone to legitimate household expenses. A significant portion of it had gone elsewhere. Following the money took Okafor's team 3 months. They followed it to a P.O. box in a neighboring county. They followed it to a bank account opened under Dennis's middle name and a variation of his social security number. They followed it to a city in western Pennsylvania, and then to an address in a residential suburb outside Pittsburgh, and then to a woman named Linda Marsh, who was 44 years old and who had believed for 8 years, that she was in a committed relationship with a retired businessman named Daniel, who had sold his company and was living comfortably off the proceeds and who traveled frequently for health-related consultations in a way that he had explained to her, apologetically, as something he needed to manage privately because of the nature of the procedures involved. Linda Marsh had no idea that Dennis Calloway existed. She had no idea about the wheelchair. She had no idea about Maggie. She had been building her understanding of a man for 8 years on a foundation that had been deliberately and specifically constructed to keep her in the dark. When investigators came to her door, she answered it in work clothes, holding a coffee mug, and listened to what they told her for about 30 seconds before she had to sit down. She was not charged with anything. She cooperated fully and without hesitation. She provided 8 years of correspondence, financial records, photographs, and testimony about Dennis's behavior and patterns that proved essential to the prosecution's case. She would later write a letter to Maggie, a letter Maggie received, kept, and never responded to, that contained, by Carol's description, one of the most honest and devastating apologies she had ever read from a stranger. The gym membership, maintained under a false name in a suburb outside Pittsburgh, confirmed what the investigators already knew from their surveillance footage. Dennis Calloway had been walking, going up and down stairs, lifting weights, entering and exiting vehicles without assistance for years. The BMW, purchased with a grant from the Disability Program for Adaptive Vehicle Equipment, and not exactly a vehicle that anyone would describe as adapted for a paraplegic, had been totaled years earlier in an accident that Dennis had explained to Maggie as a mishap involving his transit services. The money for the replacement vehicle had been paid out. It had been used on something else. Investigators obtained surveillance footage and documented Dennis walking unassisted outside his home, going up to a food truck, navigating a shopping mall, bending, carrying, lifting, all without any visible limitation or any assistive device. Yes, they documented him loading a wheelchair into the trunk of his car before VA appointments and unloading it afterward. They found, on his social media accounts, photographs of Dennis standing in a gym, taken as early as 2012, with captions that were not the work of a man laboring under any pretense of physical limitation. The phrase, "lift or leave," appeared beneath a selfie taken in a gym mirror, his body clearly visible, standing, functional, healthy. The VA physician who had issued the 2007 disability determination, the one who had classified Dennis as permanently paralyzed, would later be interviewed by investigators. He stated that he had not reviewed Dennis's prior medical records at the time of the examination. He had not ordered imaging because he had not thought it necessary. He had taken Dennis's account at face value and documented what he was told. His report became the foundation of everything that followed. It had been a failure of the system so complete, so consequential, and so easily preventable that the judge who would later preside over Dennis's trial remarked on it in open court, asking a simple question for which no one in the room had a satisfying answer. How in the world does this happen? Maggie chose not to wait for the arrest. She had been advised to wait by the investigator, by the lawyer, by Carol, who was by this point fully invested in protecting Maggie from any additional harm. But Maggie had spent 15 years accommodating what other people thought was best for her, and she was done with that. She needed to look at him. She needed to hear him explain it in his own voice. Not in the house where she had made his meals and washed his body and stayed up at night to make sure he was still breathing, so that she could carry that conversation with her into whatever came next. She chose a Tuesday afternoon. She waited until they were alone in the house. The kids were long gone and settled in their own cities, which was both a relief and a specific kind of grief, that they were not there. She went to her car and retrieved the envelope the investigator had given her. Inside the envelope were 3 photographs. One showed Dennis standing at a hotel entrance in Indianapolis. One showed Dennis in the parking lot of a gym in Pittsburgh. One showed Dennis at a restaurant table, seated with Linda Marsh, holding a glass of wine, laughing. She set the envelope on the kitchen table, went to the living room doorway, and told Dennis she needed to talk to him. She described the next 45 minutes later, in the account that would become part of the investigative record, with the kind of precision that comes from going over something so many times in your mind that the detail becomes permanent. Dennis looked at the photographs for a long time without speaking. Then he said they were not what they appeared to be. She said nothing. He said there were things she didn't understand about his recovery, about how complicated it had been, about how afraid he had been of losing everything if he admitted the truth at the wrong moment. She said nothing. He said he had still needed the support. He said the recovery was partial, incomplete, that there were things he still could not do, that she was misunderstanding the medical reality. She said nothing. And then, when the silence had gone on long enough that even Dennis, who was very good with silence, could not fill it anymore, he said something that Maggie would repeat, word for word, every time she told this story for the rest of her life. He said, "I gave you a purpose, Maggie. You know that's true." She picked up the envelope. She told him she wanted him out of the house by the following morning. She walked into the bedroom, closed the door, and called Kristen in Cincinnati. Kristen drove up that night. She was there when the investigators arrived the following morning. She was there when her father, carrying a bag he had packed himself, walking on his own 2 legs down the front steps he had descended every day for years while his wife believed he could not, got into a car and was driven away. The federal charges against Dennis Calloway included wire fraud and theft of government property. The prosecution had what is, in fraud cases, the closest thing to a gift: surveillance footage, financial records, medical documentation, and a defendant whose own behavior over 15 years had generated a paper trail so damning that the defense's options were essentially limited to arguing the margins. They could not dispute that Dennis had been walking. The footage was unambiguous. They could not dispute that he had collected payments he was not entitled to. The financial records were precise. What they could argue, and what they did argue, in a defense that was creative if ultimately unsuccessful, was that Dennis had experienced a genuine and documented initial injury, that the concept of recovery in spinal cord cases was medically complex, and that the question of exactly when Dennis became fully functional and exactly when he crossed the line into deliberate fraud was not as clear as the prosecution wished to present it. The jury was not persuaded. They deliberated for less than 2 hours. On 5 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of theft of government property, they returned a verdict of guilty on all 6. The courtroom was quiet when the verdict was read. Maggie was present. She did not visibly react. Dennis addressed the court before sentencing. He expressed remorse. He spoke about his military service, about the genuine fear and pain of his initial injury, about the confusion of a man confronted with a system that had, he said, made it easier to stay in the lie than to exit it. The judge, who had presided over fraud cases for 16 years, said that he found the arguments about systemic failure genuinely compelling, that the VA's oversight mechanisms had been inadequate, that the examining physician's failure to review prior records had created an opening that a more vigilant process would have closed. but that none of this diminished the deliberate, sustained, daily nature of Dennis's deception. The crime, the judge said, was egregious. The sentence would reflect that. Dennis Calloway received 3 years of supervised release, home confinement for the first year, mandatory community service, and an order to repay more than $750,000 in fraudulently obtained benefits. He was not sent to federal prison, a decision the judge explained publicly, with reference to the specific circumstances of the original injury, to Dennis's military service, and to factors in his background that the judge felt bore on the nature of the man before him. Whether the outcome was just is a question that different people answer differently. Maggie Calloway, when asked in the one newspaper interview she gave after the trial, said that she had stopped expecting justice to feel like what she had imagined it would feel like. She said justice, in her experience, was a legal process that reached its conclusion. It was not a feeling. She had had to find the feeling on her own. 3 weeks after the verdict, Maggie received a letter. It had been written before the trial, left with Dennis's attorney with instructions to deliver it to Maggie after the proceedings concluded. She read it alone, at her kitchen table, on a Friday evening in October. She has never disclosed its full contents publicly. What she has said in the one account she gave is that the letter contained things she did not expect. Dennis wrote that the accident on that February night in 2006 had not been fully accidental. He had been driving fast, and he had been in a state of mind that he could not fully defend. And what happened to the car that night was not entirely a matter of ice on the road or a failed steering response. He did not use the explicit language of a man who had tried to end his life, but the language he did use was close enough that Maggie understood what he was saying. He had been drowning in debt and shame and the quiet terror of a man who has built an identity on potential and found, at 43, that the potential had run out. He was not driving that night to get to a dinner meeting. He was driving because he did not know what else to do with himself. The injury had been real. The initial paralysis had been real. And somewhere in the weeks of rehabilitation that followed, as the sensation began to return to his legs, and the medical reports documented his recovery and the path back to a normal life opened in front of him, Dennis Calloway made a choice. The choice was not dramatic or sudden. It accumulated over days and weeks, the way bad decisions usually do, one compromise at a time. He had already filed the disability paperwork. The payments had already begun. Going back, admitting the recovery, dismantling the claim, facing the financial consequences of the fraud that had already technically begun, felt to him more terrifying than continuing. And Maggie, who had already reorganized her life around caring for him, who had already become the devoted and capable and tireless caregiver that he had always known she would be if given the occasion, Maggie made it possible for him to continue. Her love was the infrastructure of his lie. That is the part that Maggie has said when she speaks of it at all, that she has had the hardest time setting down. Not the loss of the marriage, not the money, though the financial damage to her retirement was real and lasting. Not even the 15 years of her own life that she devoted to a man who was deceiving her. The hardest part was the letter's implication. The thing Dennis was saying, maybe without fully understanding that he was saying it, that her devotion had made this possible. That the very quality in her that everyone admired, the quality that had made her a remarkable teacher and a remarkable friend and a remarkable person, had also been, for 15 years, the most important tool in her husband's deception. He had known exactly who she was. He had needed exactly who she was, and he had used it. Maggie Calloway sold the house in the fall of the year the trial concluded. She did not hold a sale or give away the contents dramatically. She packed what she wanted to keep into a rented truck and donated the rest and left the key with the real estate agent and drove to Cincinnati, where Kristen had found her a small apartment on a street with mature trees and a coffee shop at the corner that opened at 6 in the morning. She began substituting at a middle school in Cincinnati the following January. By March, she had been offered a part-time position. By September, she was back in a classroom full-time, teaching 6th grade English to 22 11-year-olds who did not know anything about her and to whom she was simply a teacher with reading suggestions and an inexhaustible patience for the particular drama of being 11. She did not tell anyone on the faculty her story. She did not tell her students. She got a dog, a beagle mix named whatever she wanted to name him, because she was done letting other people's preferences shape the details of her days. Carol remained in her life, the way Carol had always remained in her life, with a loyalty that had survived Maggie's anger over Carol's years of silence and that had been tested and had held. They spoke several times a week. They visited when they could. Carol had said in those first terrible weeks after the confrontation, even that she would spend the rest of her friendship with Maggie trying to make up for the years she had stayed quiet. And Maggie had told her, with the directness of someone who has recently lost patience for comfortable fictions, that she did not need to make anything up. She just needed to stay. And Carol had been staying ever since. Tyler, Maggie's son in Chicago, handled the revelation in the way that many adult children handle the destabilization of a parental narrative they have spent their entire lives accepting. With a period of intense anger, followed by a quieter and more complicated grief, followed eventually by the kind of pragmatic recalibration that life requires. He flew to Cincinnati several times in the first year. He called his mother every Sunday. He did not speak to his father and said he did not know if he ever would. Kristen, who was a nurse and who had therefore spent years doing a version of what Maggie had done, caring for people in need, managing the physical reality of bodies that require help, found that her father's deception landed for her as something personal in a way it did not for Tyler. She had chosen her profession, in part, because of her mother's example. The idea that her father had exploited that example, had lived inside it, had used it as cover for 15 years, produced in her a rage that took a long time to metabolize. She and Maggie talked about it honestly, over many evenings in Cincinnati, in the way that two women who both knew Dennis can talk about something that neither of them has sufficient distance from to be objective about. They were not objective. They did not need to be. They needed to be honest, and they were. And Dennis Calloway served his period of home confinement and completed his community service hours and moved, after the supervision period ended, to a relative's property in another state. He did not contact Maggie. He did not contact his children, at least not in any way that Maggie is aware of. Whether he has come to understand the full weight of what he did, whether that understanding is even available to a person who sustained it for 15 years and justified it for 15 years and is now trying to live with it in whatever space he occupies now, is a question no one in this story can answer. It may be a question that has no answer. Linda Marsh, who had been Dennis's partner in Pittsburgh for 8 years, cooperated with the prosecution and was not charged. She moved away from Pittsburgh the year after the trial. Maggie kept the letter Linda sent her in the same drawer where she keeps a few photographs from before the accident. Photographs from the first 19 years of the marriage, when she was young and the future was unwritten, and the man in the pictures was someone she believed she knew. She has not said what she intends to do with any of it. In the one interview Maggie granted to a local newspaper reporter in Cincinnati 2 years after the trial concluded, she was asked many things. She was asked how she had not known. She was asked whether there had been signs she had missed. She was asked what advice she would give to other caregivers who might be in similar situations. She answered all of these questions with the patience of a woman who has been asked them enough times in her own internal monologue to have arrived at answers she can live with. But the question the reporter asked at the end of the interview, the last question, almost a throwaway, the kind of question journalists sometimes ask when they have run through their prepared list, was whether Maggie had forgiven Dennis. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't forgive him for the lie, but I forgive myself for believing it, because I loved him. And loving someone isn't a mistake, even when they are." She paused, and then she said one more thing, which the reporter printed exactly as she said it. She said, "The wheelchair is still in the world somewhere. I donated it to a rehabilitation center after the trial. I didn't want it in a landfill. Even after everything, I couldn't make myself throw it away. Some things you take care of even when you know they don't deserve it. That's not weakness. That's just who I am." That is who Maggie Calloway is. It is also, if we are being honest, why the whole thing was possible in the first place. There are people in this world who are easy to love and hard to deceive, people with good defenses, careful hearts, a skepticism that protects them. And there are people who are the opposite, people so genuinely open, so constitutionally oriented toward giving the benefit of the doubt, so thoroughly constructed around the belief that the people they love are worthy of that love, that they become, through no fault of their own, ni through no failure of intelligence or perception, the ideal target for someone who understands them well enough to use them. Dennis Calloway understood Maggie completely. He had 30 years of evidence about exactly who she was and what she would do and how far she would go. And he used all of it. The question of whether that makes him a calculating predator or a deeply broken man who took advantage of a situation that had, in some ways, created itself out of his own despair and cowardice and shame, that question does not have a clean answer. Both things can be true simultaneously. People are rarely only one thing. What this story asks of us, the real question, the one that sits underneath all the legal proceedings and the surveillance footage and the dollar figures, is something harder than how do we spot the lie? Most of us will not be in Maggie's situation. Most of us will not spend 15 years providing round-the-clock care for a person who does not need it. But most of us have at some point not looked closely at something because the cost of what we might see felt too high. Most of us have filed things in the folder of things I do not need to think about. Most of us have trusted the story over the evidence, in some version, at some moment, in some relationship that mattered to us. What Maggie did was not naive. It was not failure of intelligence. It was love, operating in the way that love operates when it is real, without defenses, without a budget, without an exit strategy. The tragedy is not that she loved this way. The tragedy is that someone who claimed to love her back chose to turn that against her. And the story of her recovery, the slow, undramatic, quiet process of a woman in her 50s rebuilding a life from scratch in a Cincinnati apartment on a street with good trees, is not less remarkable for being undramatic. It is, in its own way, the most extraordinary thing in this entire story. Now I want to ask you something directly. If you had been Carol, Maggie's closest friend, who noticed something, who held on to that observation for 2 years and said nothing because the stakes of being wrong felt too high, what would you have done? Is there a version of that situation in which you speak up? And is there a version in which you understand exactly why Carol didn't? I'd leave your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think. I genuinely do. And here is the other question. The one that does not have a comfortable answer, but that I think this story earns the right to ask. We talk often in cases like this about the deceiver, about the fraud, about the person who chose deliberately to build a fiction and maintain it at another person's expense. But we talk less often about the systems, the medical systems, the benefit systems, the institutional processes that are designed to protect vulnerable people that made this possible. A physician who did not review prior records. An insurance program that disbursed $8,000 a month for nearly a decade without a meaningful audit. A set of structures built on the assumption that the person inside them is telling the truth, but without sufficient mechanisms to verify it. Dennis Calloway found the gaps in those structures, and he lived inside them. He was not the first. He will not be the last. And Maggie Calloway, who trusted the people she loved, who trusted the systems designed to support her, who trusted her own perception of reality right up until the moment a man she had not seen since the 1990s called her with something he felt she deserved to hear. Maggie Calloway is now teaching 6th grade English to 22 children who have no idea that their teacher is one of the most resilient human beings they will ever be in a room with. She is still there. She is still showing up. She is still, in her way, doing exactly what she has always done. Caring for the people in front of her, asking nothing back, building something real in the small and daily and unspectacular way that only truly steady people know how to do. She was right that devotion means something. She was right that it is worth something. She was just wrong about who it was safe with. She knows better now. If this story stayed with you, and I think it did, please like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. The next story we are covering involves a woman who raised 2 children entirely alone for 11 years, only to discover that her husband, who she believed had been killed in an accident, had been living under a different name in the same city the entire time. He attended their younger child's high school graduation without being recognized. That story is coming next, and I promise you, it will stay with you just as long as this one has. Thank you for watching. And wherever you are watching from, I hope you have people around you who are exactly who they say they are.